Good afternoon. Welcome to the Bipin and Rekha Shah Distinguished Lecture Series. My name is Martin Sancho Madriz. I'm serving as Interim Dean of the Huntley College of Agriculture. For those of you who are not familiar with our college, we're in Southern California. We are the only college of agriculture in this part of California. We have 8 undergraduate programs and 3 master degree programs with a number of concentrations. We're very thankful to Bipin and Rekha Shah for the support for this lecture series. And now I'm going to introduce Dr. Harmeet Singh, who is the Department Chair for Nutrition and Food Science in the Huntley College of Agriculture. Dr. Singh. Harmeet, you're muted.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Dr. Sancho. I'm sorry, I didn't see my mute. That's one of the things which we do many times. But thank you so much, Dr. Sancho, for introducing. And we have Mr. Shah with us also here. So I thank both of you to join this, again, second of our Bipin and Rekha Shah Distinguished Lecture Series on Plant-Based Foods. I have a pleasure of introducing our second speaker, Mr. Brent Kim. Brent earned his master's in global disease epidemiology from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where he serves as a researcher at the Center of Livable Future. His work spans farm to fork, with published works on sustainable diets, climate change, industrial food, animal production, soil safety, and urban food system. I mean, he has umbrella of work behind his research. His work has been featured in various very important or very popular magazines and journals, including Popular Science, Guardian, Huffington Post, NPR, and Newsweek. A former computer scientist, I didn't know that before, digital artist and high school educator, Brent has never lost his love for of teaching and visual communication. And I'm really happy that he agreed to join us on this meeting and helping us learn about the sustainable part of the plant-based foods, the food on that. Before I let you take over the stage, Brent, I want Mr. Shah to say maybe a few words for this seminar and how it came about, and welcome the speaker. Thank you, Brent. Bipin.
Okay, so just got unmuted. So hello, everybody. Nice to be part of this, and Brent, thankful to you for you taking the time to talk to all of us today. I won't go into the history of all this, but basically, we decided to support a minor at Cal Poly in plant-based food, and the chair of that department happens to be Professor Harmeet Singh, who you all just heard him. And based on this, we said, hey, we should have some lectures to go with this program. And that's how the second initiative came. And we're happy to support these. We've had one lecture earlier this year. This is the second one. And I can repeat the same things I said for the first lecture, that there are 3 reasons for supporting this. One is the overall aspect of sustainability and environment, to reduce methane gas emissions into the environment with a lot of the cattle raising type of things that happen for meat-based food. The second is ethical in terms of, if you look at it from our Jain perspective, then, eating any animal-based food involves killing, which from an ahimsa perspective, we obviously do not want to support. And the third is a health reason, that it has now been proven without any doubt that plant-based food is healthier for the body and the mind, and for the heart, of course. And so that is another reason to support that. So with that, let me hand it off to Brent. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
Shah. Go ahead, Brent, take over, and please post your questions in the chat box, and Colleen will be organizing them and asking the questions at the end of the speech later. And we will be sending a survey also to you to know more about what did you like and how can we make it better. So just wait for that also. And I want to thank Victor and Colleen and Pam for organizing this in the back end. There was so much work before we start with you, Brent. And you know, Brent, that how we had to communicate, everybody has to coordinate on that. And again, thank you everybody for helping and be in this seminar. Brent, please take it over.
All right, thank you, Dr. Shah, Dr. Isam, Mr. Singh, Mr. Shah, excuse me. Very grateful to be here. And particularly grateful for all of you who took the time to show up. I mean, gosh, how many of you have Zoom fatigue, right? I mean, such a strange, surreal thing. I miss being in the same room as other human beings. And yet, we're making the best we can with the technology that we have. I value your time, and I hope that what I have to offer in this hour of Zooming will be worth your time. And hopefully you can relax and kick back and enjoy in your sweatpants, right? Nobody knows what kind of pants you're wearing. So that's one of the nice things about Zoom. Before we dive in though, I'd like to ask all of you a question, and if you would please share your responses in the chat. The question is, why do you eat what you eat, right? What factors, what priorities do you think about when you're at a restaurant and you're at the grocery store and you're thinking about which foods am I going to pick? You could even think about what you had for breakfast. So please go ahead. We're going to come back to this in a minute. Start sharing in the chat. Why do you eat what you eat? What motivates your food choices? I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. Can everyone see my slides and preferably not my notes? Did I do that right?
Yes, that looks great. And we're getting some great responses in the chat. Somebody said, I eat food that tastes good. Preference, definitely religion and health is coming up a lot, as well as convenience and culture influencing what people are eating. Some folks have said they also don't want to do any harm with what they're eating, with their food choices.
Okay, sorry, I had a brief technical hiccup there. Can everyone still see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I heard people talked about what tastes good. Some folks had ethical motivations for maybe not eating certain foods. So before we dive into that, I'll first just briefly introduce the center that I'm from. So I'm a researcher at the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. Our mission is to research, communicate, and inform policy on these relationships among diet, food production, public health, and the environment. If that all sounds like a mouthful, it is. It's a lot that we cover, but to simplify it, our work basically spans farm to fork. So if it has something to do with food, we've probably done some research on it. By way of an overview, I'm going to be talking about some of our research on food and climate change. I'm going to talk about some of the different ways that animals are raised for food. We're going to share both a US perspective as well as a global perspective about some of these concerns. And finally, we're going to end on a positive note with some constructive recommendations. You saw in my title, it's a nuanced case for a plant-forward diet. So what do I mean by plant-forward? I'm referring to a diet that is mostly comprised of plant foods. That includes a vegan or exclusively plant-based diet. And if you are vegan, that's great. But for today, I'm not going to be making a case for veganism exclusively, right? So if you can imagine a spectrum, with the standard American high meat, high dairy diet on one side and a completely plant-based or vegan diet on the other. When I talk about plant forward, what I mean is that we need to be making a transition toward the plant-based diet. It doesn't mean, some folks might not want to, for whatever reason, might not go all the way to an exclusively plant-based diet, but we're moving toward a diet where the main course comes from plants. There might still be room for some animal foods, but it's mostly plants. That's plant forward. With that definition out of the way, before I make a case for a plant forward future, anytime we're having a conversation about dietary behaviors, it's important and helpful to first acknowledge and recognize, why do we eat the way we currently do? And Dr. Isom shared some of your responses. Dr. Isom, are there any more new ones that came in that you'd like to share?
Yes, mostly about family and the joy around food. So I think that goes along with the taste and the enjoyment that is a preference.
Great, and that's probably especially on our minds now with a lot of holidays coming up. Most Americans will say in surveys that their top reasons are taste, cost, and convenience. And I've heard some of you shared those as well. For some of us, our food choices are constrained by what fits within a weekly budget. Many of us, including Mr. Shah, we make food choices based on our culture or our religion, and that may mean not eating certain foods. I think we generally try with moderate success to try and eat things that are good for our health. And then, as some of you noted, some of us eat what we eat because we're concerned about the impact on the environment. So those are like our individual personal reasons. But beyond that, we also subconsciously look to the behaviors of our peers for guidance on what's appropriate, right? And that certainly applies to what we eat. Our food choices often mirror those of our family and our friends and our peers, right? So especially in America, we tend to play up the importance of free will and personal choice. And that's fine, but we also have to remember that we are social animals, and subconsciously there's a lot of social pressure to fit in. Then if we go beyond that even further, we have government and corporate policies that directly and indirectly influence what we call our food environment, right? So we don't make food choices in a vacuum. Those choices are influenced from everything from the price of food, where foods are placed in the grocery store, which foods are marketed. Even something like public transit policy could mean the difference between someone being able to take a bus to the grocery store where they can find fresh produce versus, in the absence of a bus route, they're walking to the nearest corner store and buying chips and soda, right? So, we all eat what we eat for our own very personal reasons. I'm not here to tell you that any of those reasons are right or wrong. This is a safe, judgment-free space for all dietary walks of life, as I like to say. But I do ask that you keep these reasons in mind. For more on food environments, if this topic interests you, there's a citation at the bottom. You can pursue that if you'd like to learn more about it. And I'm going to offer what I hope are some very compelling reasons why most Americans should eat very differently if we're at all concerned about the future. So without further ado, let's start with a conversation about food and climate change. Climate change, I think, probably wouldn't be here if you didn't already recognize that climate change is among the greatest public health, ecological, and economic threats, not only for our generation, but of generations to come. Global scientists and leaders have agreed that we have to cap global average temperature rise well below 2 degrees Celsius relative to the pre-industrial era, or ideally, even better, we'd cap it at 1.5 degrees Celsius. So, what is the role of food and agriculture in meeting these targets and avoiding the most catastrophic climate change scenarios? So bear with me here. We're going to go through some charts. So on the left-hand side, we have global, Dr. Isom, can everyone see my cursor right now?
Yes, we can.
Oh, great. Okay. And you can still, is my face hidden or is that? Why?
No, we can see you in the video.
Okay. I don't know why I asked that. Like, just in case I scratch my nose or pick my nose back. So I just want to make sure I know what's going on. Okay. Again, Zoom, very surreal. So thank you for bearing with me. I'm so used to doing this in person. There could be nobody there and I wouldn't even know. Anyway, so we have agriculture's greenhouse gas emissions in 2010 on the left-hand side, globally, right? All the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, and then stacked on top of that, we have the greenhouse gas emissions from other sectors like energy, industry, transport, and so on. The y-axis is gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents. Without getting in the weeds, this is just a measure of how many greenhouse gases we're producing. Those greenhouse gases are what create the greenhouse effect, which is responsible for climate change. Okay, so that's 2010. Now, we're jumping in our time machine. Over to the right, we have greenhouse gas emissions projected out for 2050. Under a business as usual scenario, meaning global meat and dairy intake continues to rise as projected by the FAO. Okay, now, this dashed line, what is that? That is the threshold for all sectors for greenhouse gas emissions that we have to stay below in order to have at least a 2/3 shot of meeting that climate mitigation target, at least a 2/3 chance of keeping warming below 2 degrees Celsius. So let me ask you, what's wrong with this picture? Go ahead and share in the chat if you see anything concerning about this. Dr. Isom, let me know when folks respond. I'm gonna have a sip of water of my giant mug right here. It keeps me hydrated.
Yeah. So you can put in the chat, what problems do you see with this, with the dashed line, if we're supposed to keep our emissions below that in order to meet our goal of reducing our global warming? You can put that into the chat, everyone.
Any brave volunteers? No pressure. It's okay, I can just tell you.
Oh, I think we've got some movement. We've got some movement.
Okay.
There we go. Everybody's got it. There's really no room left for other sectors. There's no room for industry, transport, buildings, energy.
Great. I'm so happy that all of you. Good. All right. There are other humans on the other side of this. That's great. Congrats to you. I know it takes a lot of courage to share that. You're absolutely right. I couldn't have said it better myself. There's no room for all of these other sectors to get stacked on top of agriculture, right? I mean, we have to do everything right for this crisis. We have to cut back on international flights, switch to renewable energy. We have to do all of those things to shrink that yellow part of the bar. But no matter how much we shrink it, we're not going to be able to squeeze it in right there. So we also have to address the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, which means we have to curb the rise in global meat and dairy intake. And that's very sobering and a little bit depressing, but the good news is that scientists are calling for 3 interventions, and one of them is a 75% global reduction in meat and dairy, which would shave off about 7.5 gigatons. The second intervention is reducing the amount of food that we waste and throw away. And the third that's not shown here is we have to change some of our agricultural practices. And you're going to hear that message repeated again and again, that we need these 3 interventions. But let me explain a little bit more when we released this report in 2015, since then it's been echoed again and again throughout the scientific literature that, yes, we do need to prioritize renewable energy and transportation, but we can't ignore agriculture if we're going to try and meet these targets. So let's talk a little bit, what is it about meat and dairy that contributes so much to climate change? So livestock, shown in red, are responsible for roughly 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions, which is comparable to the transportation sector. If we zoom in on where that 15% is coming from, it comes from sources so enteric fermentation is a digestive process that's unique to ruminant animals, or animals with multiple stomachs, like cows and sheep, that release methane, a potent greenhouse gas. A lot of people think, oh, cattle farts. It's not actually coming out the back. Most of it's coming out the front. So it's mostly cattle burps. It's going to blow everyone's mind. Another 25% comes from decomposing manure. So this is a manure storage pit outside of a pork facility in North Carolina, where the animal's waste is pumped out to these liquid storage pits. They're called manure lagoons. When organic matter decomposes in the absence of oxygen, it reduces methane, a potent greenhouse gas. We also have nitrous oxide, another potent greenhouse gas coming off of this manure. About a quarter comes from growing feed for the animals, and then we have a smaller share from deforestation. So this is an aerial view of the Brazilian rainforest being cleared. So forests, oceans, plants, soils, they're all what we call carbon sinks, or storehouses that hold on to carbon in the tree's tissues. When you clear that tree, that carbon is released into the atmosphere, where it contributes to climate change. So let's take a look at some individual foods. So this is from some of our recent research. Here we have the greenhouse gas intensity of producing different foods. Hopefully you can see the y-axis. I can't quite see it on my screen. Hopefully you can see it. The y-axis is kilograms of greenhouse gas emissions per serving of these foods shown along the x-axis. And these data represent global averages from over 150 countries. So we really scoured the data when we published this paper. Now, it's a lot to look at, but just some simple takeaways here. So the higher the bar, the larger greenhouse gas footprint for producing a serving of that food. Now you might be thinking, well, serving sizes vary. That's a good point, they do, but you'll generally see the same pattern whether we're looking at serving sizes, per gram of protein, per calorie, the overall patterns are the same. So in general, the animal foods on the right are in general have been found to be quite a bit more greenhouse gas intensive than the plant foods shown on the left in the green. Now, there are some exceptions. There are some relatively climate-friendly animal foods. So from left to right, we have forage fish, so fish that are low in the food chain, like sardines and anchovies. Bivalve mollusks, so your oysters, and edible insects, like crickets and mealworms. You can see the bars are quite low. So we have a lot of researchers are arguing that insects like mealworms and crickets could be an ecologically sound protein source for the future. That's purely from an ecological standpoint. So we have to be careful about focusing strictly on meat as the bad actor because it can be easy to forget about dairy, which also comes from ruminant animals. And in fact, dairy, shown here on the left, can be comparable or maybe even more greenhouse gas intensive than meat from chickens, insects, and small fish. So we're kind of trying to think nuanced and holistically here. And then beef, you probably have heard this before and are not surprised, is sort of the worst offender from a climate perspective, in part because it's a major methane source, and we can see that reflected in the height of the bar. There are some nuances to that too that we're going to come back to. So, right now we're looking at the greenhouse gas impact of producing different foods. It's even more informative if we can look at our research on whole diets, okay? So in this chart, the y-axis is the per person greenhouse gas emissions of following each of these diets for 1 year. Now, these diets are unique to the United States. When we did this study, we looked at 140 different countries. So for different countries, we'd see a different story. I'm showing you the US just as an illustrative example. As I'm saying that, I'm realizing that everything tends to be very US focused. So I apologize for that if you are tuning in from another country. Now, we didn't interview actual vegans and vegetarians to try and determine what they eat. We modeled these diets to meet certain nutrition requirements. For example, all of these diets here all provide the same 2,300 calories, and all of them meet the minimum of 69 grams of protein per day. So these are sort of meant to represent healthy versions of each of these diets. Well, at least healthy in terms of calories and protein and a couple other parameters, but not necessarily healthy from a cardiovascular standpoint. So the height of the bar, the taller bar, means a bigger greenhouse gas footprint. And you can see that the bars are broken out so you can see which food groups are contributing to the greenhouse gas emissions for each of these diets. Now, the one on the left is the US baseline, and that's kind of a rough approximation of what US citizens are currently eating. And then as we move from left to right, the diets become increasingly plant forward. There's that really neat term again. So, lacto-ovo vegetarian diet, you can see we've removed all the meat from fish and land animals, and so most of the greenhouse gas emissions are coming from dairy in this case. A pescatarian diet, it doesn't have any terrestrial meat, but it does have, in the teal here, some greenhouse gas emissions from seafood. 2/3 vegan, we think, is really neat. No one's really modeled that before. That is a diet where 2 meals you eat whatever you normally would, and the third is exclusively plant-based. So that's based in part on Mark Bittman, the celebrity chef, has a diet called vegan before 6. So two of your meals, I'm sorry, I had that backwards. 2 meals are exclusively plant-based. The third one, you eat whatever you want. I hope that made sense. And then we have a low food chain diet. Well, what is that? Remember in the previous diet, I was saying that small fish, oysters, and insects are low food chain animal foods, low in the food chain that have a relatively small greenhouse gas footprint. So we said, well, what if a person were to eat a diet that's almost exclusively plant, but we include some of those low food chain protein sources? And finally, we have the vegan diet, or exclusively plant-based, all the way on the right. And you can see all the greenhouse gas emissions there come from producing plants and only plants. So some notable findings. So, right, so this vegan diet, it provided the same amount of calories as the baseline diet, and it provided about 2/3 as much protein, but produced only 5% of the greenhouse gas emissions. And again, that's because of plant foods generally have a much smaller contribution to environmental burdens, whether it be climate or freshwater. What was surprising to us is that the lacto-ovo-vegetarian diet was still, better than baseline, but still higher than some of these others. And that's because in this diet, we're using a lot of dairy to sort of compensate for taking out the meat. And you see that anecdotally. You see folks who, well, I'm vegetarian for the environment, but I'm now eating tons of milk and cheese. And all that milk and cheese could offset some of the benefits of eliminating meat. And then, this one's quite sobering, honestly. So this dashed line is a target for food and agriculture that was proposed by some of the brightest minds on sustainable diets, the group called the Eat Lancet Commission. And they set a threshold for the year 2050 that we have to stay below, similar to the threshold you saw before, in order to avoid the most catastrophic climate change scenarios. What was quite sobering is that there's only 2 diets that we modeled that were actually below this target. So that kind of tells you how far we need to go. It's not telling us that everyone needs to go vegan, but it is telling us that we do need to get pretty on board with the PlantForward train. Good news there, but there is room for some animal foods, right? Certainly the low food chain animals. I think there's no reason to believe why we couldn't also have some, beef, pork, or chicken, as long as the amounts are very small, right? So we need to move away from this idea of meat being the main course, certainly for the environment, and pulling up the good reasons to do it too. Meat, think of it more as a side dish or a flavoring or a special treat, right? As Americans, we've become accustomed to this idea, if it doesn't have a big slab of meat in the middle, it's not a meal. I think we need to rethink how we approach that, certainly for climate change and for other reasons that I'll talk about too. I was about to have a sip of water, so it's a good transition. Yeah, so same idea here. Instead of greenhouse gas emissions, we're looking at blue water, which is a term that's used to approximate irrigation use. Essentially, this is the freshwater version of what you just saw. Instead of climate change, the taller bars here, these are foods that, with the tall bars, are the foods that use more water. And again, animal foods on the right, generally not as big a difference, but generally more freshwater intensive than plant foods on the left. Now, people often ask, and many of you may be wondering, perhaps you're from California, you're thinking, well, hey, what about all the almonds sucking up all of California's water? And I say, good point. There are always exceptions. There's no such thing as a diet with no environmental footprint. That's why this is a nuanced case, right? I'm not beating you over the head with an agenda. I will acknowledge that, probably eating a lot of almonds, growing a lot of almonds in California, probably not ideal for fresh water. We can see that nuts and seeds are on the higher end for, at least for plant foods, but not as high as bovine meat and not as high as some seafood even. Just a side note, this is seafood that's raised in ponds. That's why it's so high. In some parts of the world, in aquaculture or fish farming, they have to refill these ponds with fresh water, which is why they're so freshwater intensive. Obviously, that's not true if it's fish that you've caught out in the ocean. So I would say, well, instead of almond milk, try, I personally like milk made from peas. It has a much lower freshwater footprint, a very small climate footprint. The brand is called Ripple. They don't pay me to say that. I like it. And it's a good alternative to something like almond milk. So that's the freshwater story. Now, we've mostly been looking at whole foods. What about the Beyond Burger or maybe the Impossible Burger, right? So, well, it's good timing. We recently published a paper looking at meat alternatives made from plants, like the Impossible Burger or the Beyond Meat. We also looked at something called cell-based meat, which is meat that's produced in a laboratory, which we can't yet buy at the grocery store yet, but I think it's on the way. So in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, again, you can see plant-based meat is here, and then we have tofu and peas and pulse. So we have different. This is the y-axis here is greenhouse gas emissions per 100 grams of protein. So it's a slightly different way of comparing foods. And then we have, the meat from animals over on the left-hand side. So again, even our processed meats, the processed meats are not as low as, eating a whole food plant-based diet, which is generally what we would recommend for health. But even if you're having Beyond Burgers and Impossible Burgers, you're at least lower than beef and pork, lower than some seafood, and maybe comparable to chicken. So, when people ask about what about the Beyond Burger, we were saying, so the Beyond Burger, Impossible Burger, plant-based meats, not as ideal for climate change as eating a whole food plant-based diet, but still much lower than beef and pork. Now, cell-based meat, there's a lot of uncertainty. The height of this bar in part reflects the range of possible values. Because cell-based meat is not yet commercially available, all these studies are kind of speculative. But I'd love to talk about cell-based meat. There's just probably not quite enough time. But if you're interested, ask me in the Q&A. I'm planning that as a question. We can talk about climate impact of cellular meat. Again, same point here. The water footprint of plant-based meats lower than meat from animals. The land use to make plant-based meats lower than the land use for meat from animals. Quick point here, a lot of folks ask me, what about food miles? So the vast majority of greenhouse gas emissions in the US supply chain, which we're seeing here, are from this red slice of the pie, which is producing food. Transportation is only about 11%. So the key point here is that the type of foods we eat is more important for climate change than how far the food travels. In fact, this same study found that for the average American to eat a plant-based diet just 1 day per week would reduce their greenhouse gas emissions more than if they were to eat local for all 7 days a week. Now, I'm not throwing shade on local food because I think that's an amazing way to support your local economy and get to know your farmer and support small businesses. I'm only saying that climate change is not a major compelling reason to necessarily eat local, even though it does help. The main thing that matters is what you're eating. Are you eating animal foods or plant foods, for example? So, we have these global crises, climate change, freshwater depletion, limited amount of land on which to grow food for a growing population, water pollution. The science is clear that we're facing multiple crises, and the science is also consistent that the solutions to these food-related challenges will require a combination of the three interventions I mentioned earlier: shifting toward plant-based diets, reducing food waste, and improving agricultural practices. And if we just do 2 out of the 3, it's unlikely we'll meet the target. And in all of those studies, shifting to the plant-forward diet was the change that had the biggest impact in averting all 4 of these crises. So, hopefully I've made a case that's clear on the urgency of shifting toward plant-based diets, plant-forward diets, I should say, for the environment. I am often asked, what about organic meat or grass-fed meat? Surely these products must be better for the environment than meat from the industrial system. And that's an important question that I want to address with a couple of slides. We're going on a little bit of a tangent here. So this chart shows the number of pig farms in the US from 1955 to 2015 in gray. So we had 1.8 million swine farms, and more recently, closer to 2015, we only have 200,000. So what happened here is that bacon became very unpopular and people just stopped eating pork. That's why there was this precipitous decline in the number of pig farms. Is everyone still with me? Were there any exclamations in the chat? Are people like, what? All right, so I'm just testing you to make sure you're paying attention. That's not actually what happened. That was a lie to get your attention. So the number, these data are true, but my interpretation was completely made up. So yes, the number of farms declined, but what's this pink dotted line? Okay, this line is the number of pigs per farm in the US. So in 1955, there were a lot of farms with fewer than 100 pigs per farm. And then we moved to a very small number of farms with over 1,000 pigs per operation. And we see a similar trend. It's called consolidation for chickens and cows. It's a trend toward a smaller number of farms, but each farm, if you can even still call it a farm, houses a much larger number of animals. And this is industrialization. We've taken Henry Ford's model for producing cars and applied it to animals. And so it's not uncommon for a single operation to house thousands of cattle, tens of thousands of pigs, and millions of chickens in confined operations. Now, industrialization of agriculture has achieved tremendous efficiency in terms of minimizing human labor and maximizing output at minimal cost and in the shortest possible time. So with this system, we've been able to have an abundance of cheap meat and dairy. The problem, or one of the problems, is that the price tag we see at the grocery store does not reflect the true cost of this system for raising animals. These operations in many cases represent a public health and ecological threat to air, water quality, air quality, water quality, rural communities, workers, and the life-saving effectiveness of antibiotics. I'm going to talk about that as an example, right? So studies in the 1940s and 50s found that feeding low doses of antibiotics to chickens caused them to gain more weight faster and on less feed. So this has become common practices. There are some policies that are supposed to prohibit it in the US, but there are many loopholes, which we can talk about in the Q&A. The concern being that when bacteria are exposed to low doses of antibiotics, like in the animal's feed, it's a case of survival in the fittest, right? If you're just only giving enough antibiotic to wipe out the weak susceptible bacteria, the bacteria that remain, shown in teal, in the absence of any competition, will survive and multiply. And so this is why many of the industrial livestock operations, not all, but many, are contributing to the generation and the spread of disease-causing microorganisms that can no longer be treated with standard medicine. And when a human becomes infected with one of these pathogens, it's more costly to treat, more difficult to treat, more likely to require surgery, and more likely to be fatal. These are very expensive problems that are not reflected in the price of food. And this is, again, from our research, these resistant superbugs can spread downwind, transported by flies. They can be spread via groundwater. They're spread by workers, and they're spread through the food supply chain into the meat that we eat. Families living near these operations have higher rates of antibiotic-resistant infections. And that's just one example. Beyond the disease risks, we often hear from communities that we work with who are saying, I live near this hog operation. I can't go outside. The smell is overwhelming. I feel like I'm going to go throw up if I go outside to hang my laundry. So it's a hot day, and I've got my windows shut, and I can't go outside. And this is an environmental justice problem also because it's often low-income communities and communities of color who are living next to these operations, and these communities may not have the same political power to stop them from building one of these in your backyard. I could go on. This is a focus of our research at the center about the conditions for the workers, the conditions for the animals. Pigs are smart animals, smarter than dogs. They have rich emotional lives. We would never think about putting our dog in a cage too small for them to turn around in so they can lie in their own feces. We would never think about castrating kittens and puppies without anesthetic. But going back to those social norms we talked about earlier, we unfortunately might kind of look the other way or forget about these things when everyone else around us is, happily consuming these foods. And on top of that, the industries behind these practices go to great legal lengths to make sure that people don't know and don't see where their meat and dairy comes from. So, when I'm asked, what about organic meat or what about grass-finished beef? Isn't that better for the environment? When it comes to climate change, it's complicated. It depends. And we can talk about it more in the Q&A, but in some cases, the ecological or organic alternative may actually require more land and may be more greenhouse gas intensive to produce. However, as long as humans are continuing to eat food from animals, regardless of what the numbers say about climate change, personally, I think a strong argument could be made in favor of shifting away from the industrial model to practices that are more in line with ecological, public health, and animal welfare principles, right? We can't just think of a silo and say, this food has less greenhouse gas emissions, so we're going to eat that instead. We have to think holistically and broadly about all the different impacts of our food choices. We just have to make sure that if we were to switch from the industrial model to an ecological model, we can't simply maintain the current quantities that we're consuming. So I think of it in terms of a shift, but also a reduction, because the climate, the amount of land we have couldn't accommodate us continuing to eat the same amounts of meat if we just switched over to organic. So yes, shift, but also reduce. So, we've mostly been talking about the US. I just want to make a couple brief notes about other countries. Many low and middle income countries are struggling with hunger and malnutrition. And these are populations that are, in many cases, are barely eating any animal foods at all, and often don't have physical or economic access to a diversity of healthy plant-based options. I have the privilege and the luxury of living near an organic grocery that has every plant-based food I could ever want. I can afford all the rice and beans I could ever want. But for many of these countries, our research found that in order to meet their nutrient requirements and avoid lifelong conditions like stunting, that they could benefit from an increase in animal foods. Again, they're barely eating any to begin with. So that means that these countries, the ones in red, are actually going to increase their greenhouse gas footprint. Now, per capita, their footprint is infinitesimal compared to the average US citizen, but it will have to go up. So what does that mean for us, the countries in red, right? So to stay below the global greenhouse gas targets, remember that the targets are global. They don't care which country is producing the greenhouse gas emissions. As a net, the planet has to go down. That puts even greater pressure on the top meat and dairy consuming countries like the US to make even greater reductions in animal foods to offset the additional greenhouse gas emissions that will come from the low and middle income countries who need to increase slightly, if that makes sense. You have a few more minutes. Let's end on some positive recommendations, some constructive notes. So, I showed you this slide earlier. I keep coming back to these social norms, and subconscious behavior. So one of them is that, remember, we all look to our peers for what's appropriate. The problem with me using this slide is for you as an audience, subconsciously you say, well, gee, Americans are among the top meat and dairy consuming countries in the world. If I'm from that country, I should probably be doing the same thing so I don't stand out, right? So that's something we have to be aware of. And so I would encourage you to be aware of that bias and instead, think about like, oh, wow, the number of vegans in the United States increased by 300% between 2004 and 2019, right? Again, it's only 3%. It's not that many, but think of how many new people are shifting to this new way of eating. It doesn't have to be vegan necessarily, but when you're thinking about making the behavior change, think of these folks as your peers. And I'm going to make a few notes about effective behavior change here. And these two bullets basically summarize everything I'm going to say. There's evidence to suggest that making a gradual transition toward a plant-forward diet may be more effective than going cold turkey, pun intended, haha. And then secondly, it's important to have social support, so other people around you who have the same goals. And the details are in here. I'm not going to get into the weeds with it, but it's there. If you're watching a recording of the video, you can look at these sources and learn more about it. In a nutshell, when people see messages about making a gradual change, they're more likely to change their behavior if someone tells them, hey, you need to go completely vegan or completely vegetarian. And folks who have made a gradual transition are more likely to stick with it because recidivism is a real problem. People who go maybe completely vegan overnight and they don't do it properly, there are some things you have to be mindful of, like B12 supplementation, other things like that. So, in general, we recommend if you're going to go plant forward, make a gradual transition, and maybe just start at something like Meatless Monday as a starter. It's an easy, accessible starting point. Don't even worry about going vegan yet. Just reduce when you can. It reminds me, almost done. I bumped into a gentleman a couple of weeks ago, and he said, this vegan diet, it sounds great, but I really like honey. Honey's not vegan, so I just dropped the idea completely. I mean, what a bummer, right? Here's a person who could have benefited his health and the environment. If he had, you can go mostly vegan but still have honey. It's still of enormous benefit, but he dropped it completely because he was violating what he perceived as this one rule of veganism, which is why I think sometimes this dichotomous approach of like, well, you're either vegan or you're not, and if you're not following the rules, or same with vegetarian, right? I think we should kind of meet people where they are and think of this more as a gradual plant forward transition, not all or nothing. Because when you think in terms of all or nothing, that could be off-putting for people who aren't ready to make the full jump. Okay. This is great. I'm really enjoying this conversation. Well, I was going to say conversation. It's really just me talking. Okay, one last final point. So, this study asked the question, what are the most effective changes that one person can make to reduce their climate change impact? And the taller bars are, the height of the bars reflects the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. I'm just going to skip to the part. So our vegan diet is here. So this yellow bar marks adopting a completely plant-based diet. The key points of this paper are, yes, shifting toward plant-forward diet is critical, essential for climate change, but it's actually not the most important thing we have to do. And it's not the only thing we have to do. In fact, living car-free had more of a reduction, and avoiding just one transatlantic flight saved almost as much greenhouse gas emissions as going completely vegan for a year, right? Because remember, we have to also address energy, industry, and transportation. I get a little bit disappointed when I meet vegans who say, well, I'm vegan, so I can drive an SUV, right? It doesn't work that way. We have to be, buy green energy. That's something anyone can do almost anywhere. It doesn't matter if you're renting or what, you can switch to a green energy supplier, more efficient car. The most impactful behavior was having one fewer child. That one's tough. It's not my place to tell everyone, how many kids they should have. And you know what? I'm a child of 3. And if my parents didn't have 3 kids, I wouldn't get to be here talking to you about climate change. So, that's a tough one. But yeah, just want to give you some idea of like where plant-based diets fit within the spectrum. Last final point, right? We've been focusing on changing behavior, which is so critically important. But a problem as big as climate change is going to require concerted effort across all sectors of society. That means that we need to support businesses, institutions, and policymakers who are committed to taking action on climate change. So we'll end with the wise words of nutritionist Dr. Marion Nestle: vote with your fork, also vote with your vote. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brent. That was excellent. And I appreciate you handling the little technical glitch in the middle there. We got major take-home messages here of what we can do, which I really appreciate. I think you gave us a really well-rounded way of approaching how we can help improve the climate and just be more sustainable individuals. And so we did get a lot of good questions that I hope we can ask you. Folks, if you all have any other questions, please put them in the chat. I want to start with the Eat Lancet diet, because I think that is an excellent study as well. And somebody mentioned that they were grateful that you mentioned the Eat Lancet study. And I don't remember exactly how much meat they said that you have to reduce it to, something like 3 ounces a week, perhaps it was. But somebody brought that up because they said that perhaps some countries would not be able to implement that kind of diet, and it wouldn't be economically feasible for many countries to follow that diet. And I believe you mentioned that. So in that balance of trying to help countries that may need to increase their meat consumption or their greenhouse gas emissions compared to us, what would you say are the #1 take-home techniques that us Americans need to focus on if we're going to help the rest of the world? And if this could be in your opinion and or from the research.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think a key take-home message that we wanted to present was that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to addressing this challenge. I mean, broadly, big picture, plant-forward diet, reducing food waste, right? And the solutions are going to be very different for different countries and different populations. I think a lot of folks often ask me like, oh, well, like, what's the best diet or what's the best plant-forward diet? And I say, the beauty of it is that there isn't one perfect way to approach this. My father was of Asian descent, so I love miso soup, right? When I cook for my mom, I make something with, I throw in edamame and tofu and seaweed and broccoli, and that's my version of my protein, nutrient-dense, plant-forward meal that I love. I have a neighbor down the road who is asking me, hey, what do you make? And I'm like, well, I make miso soup. And he goes, I hate soup. Right? So you think of something that you like. I mean, we are blessed to have an abundance of plant-based options, no matter what you're into now. There's a plant-based version of it. And I think the other reason why there's no one answer, because it depends where you are now, right? I think we need to meet people where they're at. If someone's really into burgers, they're not going to be into a whole food plant-based diet just yet. I think something like the Beyond Burger and the Impossible Burger, okay, maybe they have a lot of saturated fat. They're not great for health. The greenhouse gas footprint isn't as low as tofu, but they're a perfect bridge food who aren't yet ready to make that transition. Start with the Impossible Burger, start with Beyond Burger, start thinking about your impact, and then go from there. So I think the best advice I can give is just listen to people and meet them where they're at. Start with something you enjoy and make one small shift at a time. Again, Meatless Monday, right? Just one day a week. Try that.
Thank you. That's great. I would agree with that as well, being a dietitian and trying to meet each person on an individual level. There were two questions that came in on the same topic. Question was, do you think that schools would have a big impact on decreasing greenhouse gas emissions if they transition to a more plant-forward way of eating? In your research, would school systems have a big impact?
Enormous. Well, not just schools, not just like primary, secondary schools. I think, again, going back to Mary Nestle's quote, right? It's not just our own individual behaviors. We have to think broadly about institutions. And we actually, the Center for Livable Future, if this is a topic of interest, has a report on institutional food procurement. In other words, if you can reach, so let's think about universities, right? Government administrative buildings, military bases, hospitals, prisons, right? All of these things, they're supplied by food service providers like Aramark, Sodexo, Bon Appetit, these major companies, right? So I can make a change in my diet. That's great. That does make a difference. But if you can convince the head chef at one of these food service providers to just add a couple plant-based options on their menu, that has an enormous repercussion across all the different institutions that are served by that organization. I was lucky to give a presentation a while back, and menus have changed, and I think the head chef of McDonald's was in the audience, right? So if you can reach the head chef of McDonald's, just think of the ripples that you can have with that one change.
Thank you. That's great. Yeah. And even organizations like the Humane Society, I saw they were trying to promote more sustainable plant-forward eating and helping large institutions implement these kinds of plant-forward diets into their menus. So another question for you, a lot of good questions about influencers. Do you have any tips on how influencers can support and promote plant-forward diets? Because you did talk about policy, but thinking about the influence of social media and other areas, do you have any suggestions on how they can support more plant-forward diets and sustainable living?
Well, I'm probably dating myself here, but I only recently tried Instagram, and I think I have 5 followers and I have 1 post. People tell me, "Oh, you should get on Twitter." I'm like, "Oh, like I have ADHD. Don't make me hook up to more internet things that are going to distract me and pull me away from real life." So I don't know, but I know who does. And I make a plug for a friend. His name is John Oberg. Oberg is his last name, and he is a social media influencer and a good friend. And he tries to set a positive example through his fitness and his communication about the benefits of plant-based diets. And he actually has a series of courses that you can get via Patreon on how to be a plant-based social media influencer. So I'm just going to point in his direction. Oberg.
That's great.
He's got to buy me lunch now, though, after that plug.
Right. His number of followers is going to increase dramatically after this webinar.
And I take full credit for it.
Dr. Singh, you were going to ask a question for us.
Yes, I actually want to ask Mr. Sulekh Jain. He joined us here, and I welcome him. Actually, I met him a couple of times in various places, and I have his book too. So, Sulekh ji, welcome to this meeting, and I will let you ask. If you want me to ask a question in the chat, I can do that, but go ahead and ask your question. You're on mute. I think we can't hear you. No, we can't. Yeah, right now you are on mute.
Okay. Yes, I remember Harmeet Singh ji meeting with you several years ago. And I want to thank the speaker, Brent. And I also want to thank Bipin Bhai, who has been funding this great initiative. I'm really grateful to him and his family. My question is a couple of them. But very quickly, one is, we talked about the greenhouse, we talked about the water, we talked about the land use, all of those things. My question is, during the last 200 years, this animal agriculture has pushed American meat diet throughout the world, which was not there before. What is the frequency and intensity of these COVID cases or many of these epidemics? Have they increased? Are they more severe? That will be one, because we need to look at the whole picture. We are going through for the last 2 years with COVID. This whole world has come to standstill and 5 million people have already died. So I think that's one area that needs to be looked at. And second is, just for information, 2 weeks from now, when the Thanksgiving comes, we Jains are distributing 140,000 free vegan meals to homeless people right here in this country. So that's just our little contribution I want to share. But my question is about the intensity and frequency of these epidemics.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And thank you for the generosity that you're offering. It's a great question. I'm not an expert on infectious disease, so I don't know that I can speak to COVID specifically. Something I can say is that, of course, COVID is in the attention. It has a national global attention right now. But those antibiotic-resistant pathogens that I was describing earlier, that's a completely different other pathway by which these practices are contributing to diseases on a potential global scale. Another one that we haven't talked about or haven't heard about for a while is novel influenza. And so pigs are an ideal vector for influenza viruses to genetically mix and recombine and potentially transmit to humans. So of particular concern are some operations in North Carolina where you might have thousands of hogs in one operation, and then right next door you have thousands of birds. When you have a setup like that, that is ripe for the introduction of novel influenza. Not that we needed more things to worry about, but I think there are a spectrum of ways in which this very novel experiment, I think the gentleman pointed, all this is very new, this way of raising food. It's a new experiment. And there are many potential ways in which it could introduce new pathogenic crises for people.
Thank you. That question came up also in the chat. Just seeing that, if anybody needs a dissertation, they can look into historical records of epidemics and our increase in meat consumption out of curiosity. Yes. So one more question for us. I'm just trying to pull it up here. Are there any guidelines on how to switch to a plant-based diet along with supplement vitamins to be taken? This I know is more of a plant-based discussion, and everyone, just so you all know, we will be in our next lecture talking specifically about these plant-based diets that Brent discussed. So this was perfect for us to kind of introduce this idea of why we might want to follow some plant-based diets now. How can we put them into place? So the question was if there's any guideline on how to switch to a plant-based diet along with the supplements and vitamins that need to be taken. Is there an app or resources? So yes, there's great resources. Like I had mentioned, the Humane Society has great resources on how you as an individual actually can implement a more plant-forward diet. And the reason I'm answering this is just as a registered dietitian to give you tools. Not trying to steal the limelight from Brent.
No, please continue.
And also, I think that question brings up a good point. With each of these plant-based diets, we have different vitamins and minerals that we may need to supplement with, or we may need to be more mindful of. And Brent brought up a really good point with looking at some of these other animal-based foods that are producing lower emissions. Perhaps that could be the supplement that people need if they don't have the ability economically or in a desirable or motivation standpoint to actually implement a full vegan diet, that they can still meet some of those other micronutrient and macronutrient sources of protein, vitamins, and minerals by consuming some of those foods. But yeah, I would recommend the Humane Society as a great resource. You would not think of them, but they actually have a lot of these resources already available. And then you can also go on to the MyPlate and USDA website, because they do have a whole area for resources for people who are eating more plant-based diets. So I'm hoping, at least I'm trying to put a positive light on this, like Brent did, that we are seeing an increase in the number of people who want to eat more plant-based. And so that was a good question in terms of where we can find the resources.
Yeah, Mr. Shah, Mr. Bipin Shah has a question in the chat. Bipinji, do you want to ask, or should I read it out? Yeah, you're on mute. You're on mute. Yeah.
Yeah, the question, very briefly, there's a lot of talk about reducing greenhouse gases from the energy perspective. Most of the global dialogue is focused on that. And I'm not sure how much of the dialogue is happening on the agriculture front for reducing greenhouse gases on agriculture sector. And I don't read much about it. So I was wondering if there's anything that you can point to that is happening.
Thank you for that
I
question.
know you talked about a lot of things, but at the government level, I'm not sure what is happening.
Right, and at the current, so you're asking at the current level. Thank you, Mr. Shah. I wanted to ask your question actually, and it got lost in the chat. So really the question is, we see so much of these attempts from a government and policy level in different sectors to reduce our carbon fuel bases. So Brent, the question is, what is currently being done in the agriculture sector to help with this?
Yeah, it's a great question. Before I answer that one, I love your response about the nutrition question, Dr. Isom. I just wanted to briefly add to that before I address Mr. Shah's question.
Sure.
It's funny, a lot of people ask me, I'm thinking about transitioning to a plant-forward diet. What kind of health considerations do I need to keep in mind? But no one ever asked me, hey, I'm on the standard American diet. What kind of health considerations should I worry about when I'm eating? It's just kind of funny. Like there's this idea, like yes, of course, like it's a good question to ask when you go into a plant-forward diet, but like don't forget, what we're eating now. Just inside. So yeah, no, it's funny, Mr. Shah, when a couple of colleagues and I were presenting, I wasn't there, but some of my research were being presented at COP21, the International Conference on Climate Change.
Yes.
And the menu was, there was so much meat on the menu. And my colleagues were just like, what's going on here? I mean, there's so much talk of energy and transportation, and appropriately so, we need to focus on that. But it's almost as if no one was willing to touch agriculture. So that's why we were trying to push this research to kind of get that into the conversation. I'll be honest, I'm not completely up to date on Biden's climate plan and what it entails. I've seen some talk of certainly addressing methane emissions from US agriculture. One thing that's, I've mixed feelings about is the use of funding for things like methane digesters. Certainly that is an effective approach, I think, to reducing methane from these emissions, but a counterpoint that one could consider is that you probably wouldn't have a methane digester if you didn't also have a confined industrial operation where all the manure was concentrated in one place. So there are some who argue that it is a Band-Aid that is in fact providing funding to the existing industrial system. And while it may address the greenhouse gas emissions, at the center, we try and think from a broader systems perspective. It's not just about climate change. What are the other potential harms of this industrial model? So that's a potential reservation about where some of the interventions are headed. I think as a center, we also try and address some of the policy crutches that are available for the industrial system that allow it to continue. Things like direct and indirect subsidies, tax breaks, even something like weak environmental regulations are one way of giving a free pass that makes this industrial system more viable and able to continue. So I think there are a lot of different policy levers that would need to be pulled to really correct course, I think.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you, everyone. And thank you, Brent, for a wonderful presentation. Everyone, thank you for your participation and your interaction with Brent, as well as with our questions that he was able to answer. Just so everybody knows, this is being recorded, so it will be available for you to review and will be sent out to you. Lastly, next semester, we will have our next plant-based lecture series, and our topic will be on more plant-forward eating. So we'll be able to hopefully get some techniques and strategies for implementing all of these recommendations that Brent has thrown our way. So look forward to more information regarding that. Thank you, Dr. Singh. Thank you, Dr. Martin Sancho, and thank you, Bipin and Brent, again, for all of your work on this. Thank you, Dr. Victor Yang, for his IT and tech abilities behind the scenes. So I hope you all have a good rest of your afternoon, and thank you for joining us.